Welcome back. Now, this is the heaviest lesson we are going to do for a little while, so make sure the kids are in bed or turn the stereo down or make sure you can't hear the news in the background. You really need to focus on this one. In our last lesson, we distributed some files throughout our app from our snippets. So that was just a replacement of the records view, and we replaced the records route. And we also added a record model to the models folder. If you did all of that, then you should see, once you're logged in and you click the records button in the nav bar, you should see this page. So if you don't see this, go back and make sure you follow that last lesson really closely, and you should see this. Right, so it's time to get heavy. Let's have a look at our model again. We did this in the last lesson, but you remember that our model said there are two types of field in our database here for the record when we want to put a record into our database. And the jumper, that's the jumper, and the event. And both of them require mongoose.schema.object IDs. That means that they are related to other items in our database. In this case, the person who's logged in, and we're going to put in the database ID of the logged in user here. And we're going to supply an event ID so that can be put into the event field of our record when we save it to the database. So that's just a recap on the model. Let's see how the route actually does this. So I want to point out here on the route that it still only has two things. We've been working with GET requests, which is the one we just send that we've been setting up at the very start, where we just send a user on to a working view, and we pinch that from the index file or the index page in the first instance. So those simple gets are still here, but it's actually going to do some stuff, and we're going to look at this later. And the other bit is, I just wanted to go past the post again, because this post is just like the events post. It takes the stuff out of the form, it gets the post and does the add, and it gets the stuff out of the form, and the stuff in the form in this case is only one field, and that's the centimeters field, or CMS. So it comes out of the body, which is where it saves that stuff in between pages. But there are two items here when we're setting up the record that we're going to insert manually that don't come from the form. The first is the database ID of the logged in user. So this is that, and we don't know what it is, but the database does. So the logged in user carries this ID throughout their session, and we can poke it in here when we want to set up the record. The other thing is that we're going to supply an event record to this page so that it can be held here and it can be written into the event field in the record database. Okay, so these are important. These are object IDs related to database fields elsewhere in the database that we want to plug into the record when we write it. And when we do this, it gets saved to the database. Okay, are you ready? Now, this is all done in the post. So the post is done. Let's do it. Let's just see if it works. So I'm going to pick I'm going to nominate a distance. I'm going to say I'm going to jump 150 centimeters, and it's in the long jump. Maybe I'm a better long jumper than that. Let's jump 250 centimeters, and we're going to add this. Great. This here is just a list, and if you want to go and have a look at the view, the pug that's related to this, so in the records view, if you look down here, you'll recognise a section of this that's doing all of the lists of the record. Remember, we did a loop for each event, and we wrote a new event into the page for every one that we found. We're just doing that here, the same again for the records. So for every record in records, let's put a new row in, and let's put in the number of that we are in the loop, the first record, second record, etc. And then let's put in the username of the jumper that we pull out of the record list, and then let's put in the distance that they jumped. All right. So that's easy. We've done this before. You've seen that in the events. Let's go back and see what happens when we loaded this page, though. This is important. When we add a record for the long jump, we can let's add several records for the long jump. So tomorrow I'm gonna come back and have another go at the long jump, and today I jumped 260 centimeters. This is adding them to a list in order. If I change my event though, the high jump, see I have no records for the high jump right now. There are no records for the high jump. So I'm a pretty good high jumper. I'm going to jump 2 meters for the high jump, 200 centimeters, and add that in. So I can now go back between the long jump and the high jump. That was my high jump, and go back to the long jump, and I'll see the records for the long jump and the high jump. All right. Let's log out here and log in again as a different user, BB this time. So a different user, a different Jump Club member is logged in, and they're going to record their own events or their own records. Let's have a look at the records. They see the records for the club at the moment. Now they're going to jump for the long jump 255 centimeters. Great. So add that in, and you'll see that now in between the record for the club held by AA, the BB has come along and come into second place in the record standings for their 255 centimeter long jump. Lastly, we've got another high jump, and I'm going to say that I'm going to be the record holder here as BB. So I'm going to say that I jumped 205 centimeters for the high jump, and I've gone to the top of the standings here. Great. So how is this working? How's this working? What we know is that every time we hit this, our route back here, our route, we know that the post takes the number of centimeters in the form. It takes our user ID, whoever's logged in, it takes the centimeters, and it takes the event ID from the form and plugs all of that into a new record. What happens when this page loads is that it's supplied an ID, and that ID you'll see up here. And that's because the form includes this field here, this drop list here. So if I look at the source of this page, view the source. Let's just look for long jump. Find long jump, and we'll see that the long jump. There's a long jump drop list here. There it is. And inside the long jump drop list, for every item, it's a bit hard to see, but for every item we get a link, an href to a new link. And that link gives us a unique ID for each item in the drop down. So the high jump here has its own ID, which is the high jump record ID. Now that's all done because when we load the page, this is what happens. On the get, we try to supply an ID. If we don't get one, if we didn't load this page from the drop list, then we're just putting a 0, which is true. When we hit this one, we hit a 0. This is the trickiest bit. So you just need to stay on here. Maybe watch this a couple of times. We take an ID from the that's added on to the end of the page, added on to the end of the URL right here. What we do first, so we're going to store that away as the ID, the incoming ID. First thing we do is get all of the events in the database. We learned about this in the events section of the course. We get all of the events in the database, so they're just in a list of events now. The second thing we do is we check to see what the incoming parameter is. So the incoming number, this one here, this 0 in this case, it's known to the page, it's known to this route by the time it gets here. It's fed in as this, rec.params.id. Now we've just said if it's a 0, just reset it. Reset rec.params.id to the first record ID in the database that we just found. So we just went and got all the events. We've held them in a list. If we find a 0 in the list, in the URL, then we're just going to set that URL incoming parameter, reset it to a valid ID, which is just the events list and the first ID. We do that because we need to find all of the records that are related to that event. So the first thing we do is, now that we've got a valid record ID, we use Mongoose again to get a specific event. So this is another find by ID, is another Mongoose call, which is like the find one, but gets a specific event. So it's going to get that event, and we're going to call that event on its retrieval this event. Get it? We get all the events here. We set up we either retrieve or set up an event ID, and then we get a specific event and we call it this event. So by now we've got a list of all the events and all of the information about a specific event. The last thing we do is do a record.find, and in this case we provide, see here, the ID that we set up here. That means what we're going to do is we're going to find all of the records, for which the event ID is the one we fed in. Meaning that if we fed in the long jump event ID, we're going to get all of the records associated with the long jump. Did I say long jump? If we fed in the long jump ID, we're going to get all of the long jump records back from the database. Finally, we're going to send the user on to the records page, and we're going to send along the list of events that we got back. We're going to send along the list of records for the event that we were looking for, and we're going to send all of the event information related to this event, and we're going to send it all back to the records view. What happens in the records view? Well, the records view loads from the top. And it says, let's put in that very first drop list, this one here. Let's find where that drop list is populated. So here is the drop list, here it is. So we're going to put a button drop list here, and we're going to style it with our classes right there. It's a button type, it's a drop down type, and we're going to add events to it. So for each event that we fed in, so every time we add an event to the database, it'll loop through all of those on loading this page and add them as drop-down menu items. And behind the scenes, it'll say, when you click this item, load up the records page and add to it the event ID. That means that that's what gave us that code in the background. So in the background, remember we went and had a look at the source of this. So every time we select one of these, behind the scenes, it's providing an ID up here to the page, which means it's going to load all of the events for that, all of the records for that event, the long jump and the high jump. See this event change, these ID changes, long jump, high jump. That event ID is fed into our route again. Let's go back to our route. All that happens is it's fed into our route as an ID. We find all of the events that exist, all of the events. We this time don't find a 0 in the thing, so we just retain the ID, and then we say find all of the events related to that incoming ID, and then find all the records for that event. The Pug then lists them all, or should list them all. Is it doing that yet, or do we need to go and do that? No, it's just it does. It lists them all down here by looping through them like we saw before. Down here is our loop. There it is. So this loop does all our records. Okay, so a bit of a heavy lesson. Might need to go and watch it a couple of times, but that's what's happening. And I'll do as quick a recap as I can right now. Our Pug, our list here, our view is looking for a drop list and a set of events to attach to that drop list. It's looking for an event and a set of records to attach to that event down here. Our route does only two things. It either adds records on a post, and we know all about that, and when it does that, it writes in my user ID, the ID that's related to me in the database. It adds in a record ID, the ID related to that event in the database, and the number of centimeters that came from the form. Every time this page loads, it's going to find all of the events and store them in an events list. It's going to find a specific event relating to either the one we fed in or the first one in the list. It's then going to go and find all of the records that exist for that event and pass all of that stuff through the events list, the records list, and this event information back to the view. All right, stay here till you understand that one and make sure that your file is working like mine and that you're able to add events, and then you're ready to go on to our next one. A bit of a heavy lesson, I know, but a very important thing to understand. And I think that's probably why a lot of tutorials don't go into it. Hopefully you got it.